Thanks for stopping by to check out this episode of Vintage Audio Review. In this episode, I'm going to talk about this Onkyo TX-8500 MKII Receiver. In 1979, Onkyo sold this for $1,000. As a reference point, in 1979, you could buy a 6-cylinder brand new Chevy Camaro for $4,700. There is also an 8500 Mark I, which had less power and was a little bit smaller than this as well, but this is the 8500 Mark II. It was rated at 160 watts per channel into 8 ohms at not more than 0.05% THD from 3 Hz to 30 kHz. Now, it did have some interesting features. The tuning knob here had a phase lock on-off. If you touched it, the lock would go off, so it would make it easier to tune. The FM tuner doesn't really work on this, as you'll see later, but the display comes on. Also, it does not have an auxiliary input. It has something called EPS, which was where you would connect your equalizer or some kind of a sound processor, if you like. And what you can do is you can use the EPS input as an auxiliary input, which is what I did for the testing. This was brought to me to be looked at by my good buddy Ian, who has been in several of my videos. It had been lying around for several years and he wasn't sure what kind of status it was, so he asked if I wouldn't mind checking it out. Even though it is missing all the FM preset buttons on the front and is missing the glass plate that went over the dial, which Ian is working on finding a replacement glass dial for the front, as well as some knobs for the FM tuner presets. As I got into testing it, I started noticing that it tested really good. Now, this is all original, so this would be about 44 years old, and there has been no work done on it that I could tell. It had a few little things that needed to be cleaned and lubed as best as I could. As I started testing it, I was really impressed with some of the measurements that I made on it. So you'll see all of that later on in the video, and now we're going to do a little tour, the front, the back. I'll take the top off and you can kind of see the circuitry inside. And I should point out that it is a dual mono design, so it has a separate power transformer and capacitor filter bank for each channel. So sit back, grab a beer, grab a glass of wine, a shot of whiskey, coffee, water, and I hope you will enjoy this video on the Onkyo TX-8500 Mark II. Here is what the Onkyo 8500 Mark II looks like with the cover removed. We have two independent power supplies, one for each channel. The power transformers and capacitors for each channel are right here. These are 15,000 microfarad at 78 volt capacitors. Here are one of the output transistor stages for one of the channels. We have our NPN is here, PNP is here. It's a Class AV amplifier, and on the other side for that channel we have the other NPN and PNP output transistors. Our tuner is right here. The tuner in this unit doesn't appear to work, at least the FM state doesn't appear to be working right. Here is a tuner board. Here's the Dolby FM board, I believe, and these guys right here, see if I can zoom in on them a little bit. These are the preset switches for the AM and FM tuner. And this is just a different view of the inside of the Onkyo receiver. And you can tell there's a lot of rust on here. Possibly this was in a humid environment, I would imagine. And you can kind of just see a little bit more of the output transistor stage, and the driver board for the transistors are here. And our speaker connections are all here, and that's kind of it from the inside. Here is a close-up view of the Onkyo TX-8500 Mark II, and we'll start over here on the right. This is our tuning knob. We do have our selector switch here, so you can go AM, FM, Dolby FM, and then there's two phono inputs for moving magnet phono cartridges. Here is our tape monitor selector switch, and we do have two tape monitor sources. Here is our volume control, and it is detented all along the way. These guys right here that are missing buttons, these are presets for at least the FM. I'm not sure about the AM, but definitely for the FM. And I believe you tune them in and then you can lock the station using this button right here. We have a loudness switch here and a stereo mono switch there. Our 20 dB muting switch is here. The balance control is there, and it is center detented. The treble, mid, and bass controls all have detents. And over here we have our speaker selector switch. You can have speaker A, speaker B, speaker C, or A plus B or A plus C. Headphone jack and power button. We have a couple of filters here. There's a subsonic filter, a low filter, and a high filter. These two push buttons allow you to change the crossover points for your bass and treble controls. The bass is 125 Hertz or 400 Hertz, and the treble is 6 kilohertz or 2 kilohertz. We also have a FM muting switch right here, and this EPS is, we'll see it on the back, but it allows you to hook up like an equalizer to it or some other kind of a line level processor for your audio. However, it can also be used as an auxiliary input if you press it in, and in fact I am doing my testing using this as an auxiliary input. It also has indicators for all your stereo tuning here, and then if your EPS is on, as well as which tape monitor you're on, and AM, FM, Dolby FM, and all that. I'm not sure how many of those lights are still working. Let's just see here. AM light comes on, FM light does not, Dolby FM comes on, and then Phono 1 comes on, and Phono 2. So we got quite a few lights that do work. I'm not sure that the FM tuner works. If I go ahead and move it, I move to the unlock position. If I move it, we don't really see any changes, so the FM tuner will just stay broken. This obviously is the rear of the Onkyo TX-8500 Mark II. And we have our 3 sets of speaker connectors right here, and they're the kind where you loosen them up and then slide your wire down in between them and the metal connecting plate. We have 2 unswitched outlets, 1 switched outlet. Our AC power supply fuses are here. This right here is for the FM 4 channel out, if that ever came about. Here is a sensor input, and that sensor is the tuning knob in the front, and apparently that sets the sensitivity for when you touch the tuner. It detects that you touched it, and it removes the phase lock loop circuitry so that you can tune it close to the station, and then you release the knob and then it locks the station. That's kind of a cool feature, and this sets how sensitive it is. Here are our pre-out main in jacks, and those normally would be jumpered, but I was testing each stage a little bit. Here is our EPS connection points, and if you want to use an auxiliary input, you can connect it to the in here and switch the switch on the front to EPS, and it will act as an auxiliary input, or its original purpose was more for hooking up an equalizer. We have our 2 tape monitor circuits here. Our phono input is here for number 2, and for number 1 it's here, and here are our FM and AM antenna connections, as well as the loop antenna for AM, and here is our phono grounding lug there. Here is the standard THD SNR plot at 1 kilohertz, with the Onkyo putting out about 5 watts into 8 ohms. I adjusted the volume control such that we got about 28 dB of gain. You can see the THDs are less than, we'll say 0.03%. Our SNRs are right around, we'll call it 80 dB, and the THD plus noise is right at minus 70 dB. So it is looking fairly good. Here we have the THD SNR plot at 1 kilohertz with the Onkyo putting out 160 watts into 8 ohms. Now the specification was 160 watts into 8 ohms at not more than 0.05% THD, and we are at 0.04% THD, so we are meeting that spec. And this amplifier is what, 44 years old or so? As best I can tell, this is all original, so that's pretty impressive. SNR is 90 dB. THD plus noise, we'll say around minus 70 dB. We're still close to 28 dB of gain, so it's looking really good. Now I'm going to go bring up the harmonic. So this shows our harmonic breakdown, and as expected, we have our odd harmonic, which is the third harmonic is much greater than the even or the second harmonic right here. Here we have the frequency response of the TX-8500 Mark II, and this is from 20 hertz to 20 kilohertz. The specification is plus or minus 1 dB over that range, and we are currently putting out 5 watts into 8 ohms, and you can see the low end of the frequency response is pretty good, down 0.4 of a dB, and at the very high end of the band it's down maybe a dB depending on which channel you look at, and the channels are balanced very closely as well. So this thing is meeting its requirement. This plot shows the THD versus frequency at a couple different power levels, and that's into 8 ohms. We have power levels of 100 watts down to 6 watts. You can see that the very worst case THD would be right here at 100 watts, and that's for the left channel, and in that case the THD is less than 0.06%, so that is doing really good. It's a little bit higher than the specification of less than 0.05%, but overall I would say this thing looks really good as far as the THD versus frequency at several different power levels. Here is the multi-tone response with the TX-8500 Mark II putting out about 5 watts into 8 ohms, and it's showing a distortion-free range of about maybe 12 to 14 bits, which is really pretty good for something this old. This plot shows the output impedance of the Onkyo TX-8500 Mark II. It is showing a damping factor of between 27 to 30. The specification was at least 50. Here we have the system noise level of the Onkyo TX-8500 Mark II. In this case, the EPS input has been selected, and those inputs are terminated into shorts. Also, the output has 8 ohm loads on it, and the volume has been set for about 28 dB of gain. The specification was at least 95 dB with the A weighting applied, which we have over here, and you can see probably the worst case is right around here, which is about minus 90 dB. That's our good old 60 hertz hum bar, and so we're not too far off that 95 dB requirement. This plot shows the crosstalk of the Onkyo, and in this case the channel that is not being terminated is putting out 5 watts into 8 ohms, and while there is no specification for the crosstalk, you can tell it's anywhere from, we'll say, almost 100 dB to as low as about 45 dB, depending on which channel it is. But overall, 45 dB would be the worst case crosstalk for either left to right or right to left at 20 kilohertz. Right now, we're looking at the Phono 2 input to the tape monitor 1 output, and this is with a 5 millivolt or minus 46 dBV signal applied. You can see the gain is about, we'll call it 35 dB of the phono stage. The THD is really low. This is less than 0.002%. The SNR with A weighting applied is 77 dB for the right channel and 62 dB for the left channel. There is a specification for SNR, and with A weighting for the phono, it is 88 dB, but that's with a 10 millivolt signal applied. So I'm going to go ahead and bump it up. So I bumped up the input signal so that it has 10 millivolt applied, and we are not at 88 dB SNR. We're getting closer with the right channel at 80 dB, left channel's at 65 dB. But overall, our distortion is looking really good for this fairly old phono input, and that is a moving magnet phono input. Here we have the frequency response of the Phono 2 input to the Tape Monitor 1 output from 30 hertz to 20 kilohertz. Now I chose 30 hertz because there was a big drop off here at 20 hertz, but at 30 hertz to 20 kilohertz, this is what we have. There is a specification of plus or minus 0.2 dB, and we're maybe nothing on the plus, or very little on the plus side of that, and we're down maybe 0.3 of a dB. So overall, that is really pretty good. Of course, we've got 5 millivolts coming in. We do have some little noise spurs, which is normal, and we do have some noise here on the right channel, but those are overall pretty small. I doubt you would hear them. So this is really pretty flat. Here we have the THD SNR plot at 1 kilohertz with the input going to the EPS in, and our output is the preamplifier out. Now there is not a specification for this section of the Onkyo. However, I adjusted the volume so that we have 0 dB of gain, and we've got a 2-volt signal going in, which means we have a 2-volt signal going out. Our SNRs are above 90 dB. That's great. Our THD is less than 0.01%, and the THD plus noise is right around minus 80 dB. So overall, this thing is looking really, really good. Here we have the frequency response of the Onkyo, and in this case, the signal is going into the EPS input, and we're measuring at the tape monitor output from 20 hertz to 20 kilohertz. The volume control is set for 0 dB gain. We've got 2 volts going in and 2 volts going out, and it's showing maybe at the high end of the band we're down 0.5 dB for the left channel, and maybe 0.3 of a dB on the plus side over here on the high end of the band. Now the tone controls are all set to their 0 detemp position as best I can tell. So it's really a fairly decent frequency response considering this thing is so old. This plot shows the multi-tone response, and this is looking from the EPS input to the preamplifier output with the volume control set to give about 0 dB of gain. And we're showing somewhere, I would say for the most part, about 14 bits of distortion-free range, which is really pretty good for a preamp of this vintage. This plot shows the crosstalk. In this case, the signal is the EPS input and the output is the preamplifier output. There is no specification for this, but both the left to right and the right to left crosstalk is looking like it's anywhere from, we'll say at best case, it is about 108 dB for the left to right crosstalk, and then they both end up around 48, 50 dB of crosstalk at 20 kilohertz. This plot shows the effect of some of the Onkyo's filters. This blue line in the center is with everything set flat. When you flip on the loudness, you get a boost like this, kind of like the smiley face where the mid-range stays pretty much the same, and then you get maybe a 3 dB boost at the low end of the band and another 3 dB boost at the high end of the band. Our low filter is this guy right here. That's its response. And the high filter shows this response here. And this guy right here, this green line, is the 20 dB muting, which is pretty darn close to 20 dB. I forgot to mention the size of the Onkyo TX-8500 Mark II. And it comes in at 62 pounds and is 21 inches across by about 8.5 inches tall by 17 inches deep. So it is indeed a big receiver. As you saw from the measurements, this guy did really, really well in its electrical performance. While I did not listen to the phono section of it, the phono section did test very well and was surprisingly flat. It has a very clean preamp, and I could see somebody just wanting to use this as a preamp if they wanted to. Said the biggest negative is it doesn't have a readily available auxiliary input. You have to use the EPS, which really isn't that difficult. You just have to remember to press in the EPS button on the front. But it works just fine. For my listening test, I hooked this up to my Wilson Watt 3 Puppy 2 loudspeakers, and it sounded really good. There were no turn-on thumps, no turn-off thumps. The hum with the volume control set midway was non-existent with no input going in. It was very clean. It was so weak I was straining to try to hear any hum. It just was clean, just sitting there with the noise that it put out. Very impressive. It sounded really good. It was lively. It had plenty of bass and the highs and the mid-range. Everything just sounded good on it. I just was really surprised at how well it sounded. Well, I shouldn't have been that surprised. It measured great. I've seen very few amplifiers that were over 40 years old that actually met some of the requirements. They may come close. I'm not going to complain about something that's 0.1% instead of 0.05% THD, at 100 watts. It's kind of meaningless. It's just a number to see if they actually met the requirements that the manufacturer stated. But Onkyo, this is the first piece of Onkyo gear that I tested, and it just impressed me. I would put this on the level of Marantz. Shoot me, but there's no doubt this sounded as good as the Marantz receivers that I've looked at. I think this sounded better than the 9090 in my mind, from what I remember when I tested the 9090. But this just has plenty of power to drive it just as much as you want it. I just really think that this is a good receiver. Even though it looks ugly, I'm sure Ian will find a good use for it. It's not easy to work on. That would be a negative. I'm not going to go in and try to fix that tuner problem. It just works really good as a preamp, as a power amp. It just is a good piece of vintage gear, and my hat's off to Onkyo for their quality in this. Once again, I thank you for taking time out of your day to watch this video, and as always, I like to hear people's opinions in the comments. If you like the video too, give it a thumbs up. I guess if you don't like it, you could give it a thumbs down, but let's try to avoid that. If you have not subscribed to the channel, that would be very helpful to make the channel grow. And when I get together with my friends, I can say, oh yeah, I have a YouTube channel, and it's just not friends and family. So once again, until next time, have a great day or night.